Hello everyone and welcome to episode 5 of Cave Escape, and this week unfortunately it's just myself, Kieran, and Paul is away and he can't make it, but thankfully this is the first interview we'll be having, and it's with Aaron Good. And I was introduced by Aaron by one of my favourite academics, Peter Dale Scott, over Facebook, and he sent me an email saying essentially this is an article you must read, and he sent me an article that Aaron has recently published called American Exception, the Hegemony and the Dissimulation of the State, which is a really fascinating article and really great for anyone out there interested in deep politics or deep state theory or dual state theory or parapolitics and that kind of level of corruption and those sort of concepts. And I'm lucky enough to be interviewing today for Cave Escape. And so without further ado, Aaron, welcome to the podcast. And if you could tell the folks out there who may be listening, the one or two, a little bit about yourself and the research you're doing, that'd be wonderful.
Sure, thank you. Well, I'm at Temple University working on a PhD. My prospectus has been approved and I need to basically write the document. But I had a number of jobs before I started my graduate school career. I worked as a high school teacher. I worked on Obama's campaign in 2008 in a time when I had a probably more optimistic view about the American political system. I lived in Taiwan for a year. I've had a number of different jobs before deciding on the academic career, and I still teach high school at the moment while I'm working on my PhD, and live in Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania, Bucks County. My academic work focuses on the state and is a way that I try to look at all of those things that you mentioned: deep politics, parapolitics, the nature of the state, and the character of U.S. hegemony, aka U.S. imperialism, and looking at theories of the state and ways of understanding the state that can explain some of the anomalies that conventional political science and conventional social science in general just ignores. All of those things that are ignored. And as you know, there's a lot of those things. In a liberal society, you have a tendency to want to, for people to kind of accept the overall integrity of our institutions and the idea expressed by the pluralists, in the middle of the 20th century, that elites play by the rules of the game, more or less. And there's enough in the historical record, I think, to really cast doubt on or basically destroy that assumption. I think that the elites don't really play by the rules of the game, and they're never held to account for it, or very rarely. And this is the most obvious in the realm of foreign policy, and it becomes especially acute after World War II, when the U.S. emerged in an unprecedented position of power. And so where the dual state theory comes in is in regards to the creation of the national security state. And you have a number of theorists who argue about a dual state, which is an undemocratic, hierarchical state that is parallel to and sometimes supersedes the formal public state or the democratic state. And what I try to look at is what I want to focus on in the theoretical innovation that I would, I guess, hang my hat on is the idea of a tripartite state, a state made up of sort of three overlapping states, a security state, a public state, and a deep state. And the deep state, which people like Peter Dale Scott have theorized about, or Ola Tanander, this sometimes is thought of as being synonymous with the security state, but I argue that it's a sort of a separate entity, that it includes the overworld of private financial interests and the intelligence agencies and the links between the wealthy the private wealth in America and private wealth, in the West in general, and that those links themselves they comprise a state in and of itself, and that's sort of even more unaccountable than the security state. That you not only have the security state, but you have to look at the way the security state actually came into being. Like the security state was a creation of the public state, things like the National Security Act, 1947. But when you look at the way that it was created by Wall Street interests, people like Alan Dulles and people from other Wall Street law firms, people like Clark Clifford, who penned the phrase that gave the CIA the right to launch all of these covert operations. These are people who are connected to the wealthiest strata of society, and it's a politically active strata of society. And they have been able to use the security state to perpetrate all sorts of mischief all around the world. And a lot of these things are famous or infamous, like the coup in Iran in '53 and Guatemala in 1954, and really a really considerable number of episodes similar to that. And it's just an ongoing project that seems to be done to secure the power and wealth of a small strata of society, and it's not really put up for democratic debate. It's typically minimized or obscured by the mass media, and the public is generally kept in the dark about the logic behind all of these interventions around the world. And so, being a scholar, I thought that to try to illuminate some of this is where I would want to focus my efforts, because I think that really humanity needs a better understanding of these things if we're gonna move on to a more enlightened way of existing in the world.
Oh, great! That's a fantastic summary and analysis of your work and deep state theory in general. Thank you for that, Aaron. So yeah, it's extraordinarily fascinating stuff. One question I was going to ask: how did you get into, or sort of discover, as it were, that level of political analysis? So, I told Aaron before the podcast, people who are listening, that there's a friend from university who was quite into conspiracy theories, and I, being a student of politics, I would discuss with him and debate with him certain concepts, and he got me to look up and go to certain websites and look up certain events and organisations, and it sent me down that very alternative conspiratorial path. Unfortunately, there's a lot of nonsense and a lot of what I would call illegitimate lenses that certain groups try to view the world through, such as this idea of perhaps like an extra-dimensional alien force which has infected the elites of the world and is trying to control the masses through blood sacrifices and other such very strange, and there's all sorts of those out there. But then there's more subtle, more nuanced analysis coming out of the likes of especially Peter Dale Scott, who's really at the forefront of a lot of this research, which is really interesting. So how did you get into it? Was there a particular person, website or event that you looked into and you realised, wow, the world really doesn't work the way I thought it did?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I grew up in Indiana in the 80s, and my mother worked for she was a congressional staffer for the late Congressman Frank McCloskey, a Democrat from Indiana. And I remember I was a little kid and watching the Iran-Contra hearings on TV. It's maybe an odd little kid in some ways, because I would watch Oliver North and these other guys speaking, in front of congressmen and try to figure out what was going on. And so this is one of the formative political experiences of my life, probably, and I was like 10 or 11. And I had the idea from my mother that Reagan was, that even though all of my classmates loved Reagan and they made the sort of prevailing consensus in Middle America was that Reagan had done a great thing by making Americans feel special and strong again. I had I was of the mind, thanks to my parents, as most kids would be, that he was not a good man and that he was not really what he seemed and that he was a bit of a fraud, and that the government was up to all sorts of criminal mischief. And so during the Iran-Contra hearings, you have guys like Ollie North who seem to have pretty clearly broken laws and committed crimes, and yet nobody could really be held accountable for it. It seemed like it was a global criminal conspiracy that was blatant even in terms of what was known, and yet they really could do nothing about it. And so that, I think, stuck in my head, that power is kind of unaccountable, and that that the laws are not really followed, and that I wouldn't have known who Thucydides was at the time, but I think that his the quote from Thucydides, or it's not Thucydides who says it, but it's included in the History of the Peloponnesian War, where he says the strong do as they will and the weak suffer what they must. Well, some element of that, I think, stuck with me in terms of the way the power operates. I also saw Oliver Stone's JFK when I was pretty young. I think it was I saw it in the theater, and that was like a 3-hour movie, and I found that pretty riveting because I knew enough about Vietnam to know what a disaster it was, and because my mother worked for veterans with PTSD who were trying to work with the government. And I knew that she had protested the war when she was in college. And so I knew that it was this really brutal slaughter that we inflicted upon these people halfway across the world who, for no reason that made any sense to me. And so the movie JFK resonated with me. I saw it in the theater, and then when it came out on VHS, I watched it, maybe 6 months later, I watched it again. I would have been only like in 7th grade or something like that. But I just found it fascinating. And I did extra reading about some of these characters like Guy Bannister and David Ferry and these people that were involved with Oswald. And even though I read reviews at the time that said, well, Stone made things up and this and that, there were elements of it that just seemed like very hard to explain, even if you acknowledge, well, Stone used some footage and then edited it to make it look as though it was documentary footage. I thought, well, you can sort of figure out what's speculation and what's not, but a lot of these things are really hard to explain away. And so, not that I didn't spend much time reading about the case, when I was in high school or anything else, but I remembered it. I remembered it pretty well, and it seemed like another case where power was just kind of unaccountable to me and unknowable, and so. I studied political science in college, was pretty conventional about my beliefs at the time. But, on the liberal side of things, I would say I was a liberal. I went to Taiwan for a year after that and taught English. And then when I came back, almost immediately when I came back, 9/11 happened. And that was very discouraging because it seemed that it was very bad what had happened, and this patriotic kind of this orgy of patriotic self-congratulation and victimization at the same time was that it was not healthy and that bad things were on the horizon. And that turned out to be the case, so that made me a little bit more cynical about politics. I tried to work for Kerry in 2004 in some capacity, and he lost, and he was a pretty weak candidate. I still had some faith in the Democratic Party and the establishment Democratic Party. I don't, in retrospect, I don't know why, but I think maybe because of being raised by a good Democrat, and because they do, on the surface, seem to be less deranged than their Republican counterparts. George Bush is a cartoonishly inept figure, and Cheney, the vice president, is even worse. Seems outright sinister. And so, by comparison, the Democrats seemed like a good alternative, and I worked for Obama in '08. I really hoped that he would prosecute Bush and Bush administration officials. I hoped that he would end imperial wars. I think that when the government of Honduras was overthrown early in Obama's presidency, that was one of the first and that was very early. I realized that things were not really going to change very much, and that was further reinforced when the war on Libya took place, which was a grisly imperial Roman spectacle almost, with Gaddafi's, the snuff film made of Gaddafi that Hillary Clinton laughed about later. But I should also add that maybe around 2005 or 2006, I just on a lark ordered All the Shah's Men, Stephen Kinzer's book on the overthrow of the Iranian government and the CIA role in that. And I hadn't really read that much about the CIA in the intervening years between like seeing Stone's movie and that point in time. But reading that made me think. I got the impression, and which still sort of stands to this day, that the Cold War was really not what it was packaged as. That it was really a sort of window dressing for corporate hegemony being extended over the entire world. Mossadegh was not a communist at all. What he had wanted for his country seemed totally reasonable, to nationalize the oil and not have the country's oil wealth sucked out by Western oil companies, and immiserating his people in the process. Like, it was what you would expect a democracy to be, sticking up for the country, the country of Iran. And so but I still had some faith in and went on to work for Obama after that, and thought that the system was, essentially maybe receptive to pressures for change. And so, but after Obama gets elected, and seeing what happens in Honduras and Libya, and seeing the way that he treats the bankers, and seeing how very little changes and there's no prosecution for a very serious crimes committed by the financial industry and by the national security state under George W. Bush, I became more radical in my thinking about things. I started to think that, these guys do seem like criminality goes unpunished. Criminality goes unpunished, and what do we do with that? The elites don't play by the rules of the game, and by and large, people don't really recognize or dwell upon the criminal nature of the prevailing order. And in studying political science, mainstream political science, this is also kind of glossed over. That it really, we have many people who specialize in many areas of political science, and yet this particular area, that just, where you attempt to look at phenomena and study them in depth, right? But looking at these things that would seem like to be criminal policies and continuity across administrations, like things that should be of interest to social scientists, for some reason don't really get studied. And that's almost a story in and of itself. So that was the direction that I wanted to go in. And I met with, I started to communicate and correspond with Lance DeHaven Smith, who wrote about state crimes against democracy. And we've had Lance. He's at Florida State. He was just given a chair this year for Ruben Askew, former governor of Florida, has an endowed chair at Florida State, which Lance took this year. And this is probably his last year at Florida State. He's going to retire, but he wrote the book Conspiracy Theory in America, and he's written a number of other books. But his focus is state crimes against democracy. And that's what that was one of the main things I wanted to write about and do more research on. And so the tripartite state is a way to kind of reconcile what Lance was writing about, state crimes against democracy, with Peter Dale Scott's work on deep politics and the insight that what we're dealing with is not necessarily just the state. as it's popularly understood, that there are elements of in state-society relations that are really key and pivotal here. And so, but at the same time, they were crimes against democracy. They were crimes against, and the victim was democratic processes or democracy. So there was, one of the things I've wanted to do, one of my guiding motivations is to try to reconcile the state crimes against democracy with deep politics. And the tripartite state theory is my attempt to do that, to try to have a way to systematically understand what is happening to us and how we might speak to it.
Oh, great! Thank you. I mean, a lot of interesting stuff you said there, Aaron. I wanted to talk about further your idea of the tripartite state, focusing on the deep state section of that, with regards to the history of deep states. I know some authors or some scholars have tried to put a particular date or era on when the deep state emerged. I mean, I know in Government of the Shadows, for example, Robert Cribbs, in his, I think he has the introductory chapter in that book, and he talks about how it's a modern phenomenon, and he says it emerged, I think, in sort of post-World War One with the rise of the sort of the bureaucratic state, the bureaucracy which comes out of that, I think, sort of large-scale defence/war departments. And I know in your article you talk about Hans Morgenthau and his... he talks about how all modern totalitarian states have this dual element within them. And more recently, Michael Glennon, in his book Double Government, he talks about, he references British Parliament and how in the Victorian times, even though it's a very, I think in some ways, an almost superficial analysis of this idea of double or two or more states, fragmenting and fighting for power against each other internally. He talks about in British Parliament, you had the House of Lords and the monarchy. They looked to be they were sort of the public state, but the true power was the House of Commons and the Prime Minister and the cabinet that they formed. So, I mean, history's always... it's important to almost every form of political science, especially the Marxian traditions and anarchist traditions and other critical traditions generally. Would you put any date or era? I mean, would you date it back to like pre-capitalist times or post? I mean, did it emerge purely out of this globalized capitalist world, which most scholars of globalization argue came about in the late 1400s with colonialization and the spreading of modern capitalism around the west of the world? I mean, is it, in your mind, is there a point where you can say, wow, this is one of the earliest known, what we can truly call like deep states within this tripartite state sort of nexus?
Yeah, I think that the tripartite state in America emerges after World War II and the creation of the modern national security state. But I think that the idea of a deep state is probably something that emerges really with civilization. I think that there's always a power behind the formally organized systems of power in by and large. I mean, they may overlap almost perfectly at times, but I think that you can talk about, the pinnacle of power and its relationship to the formally organized structures of power in a civilization, and that they're not always the same thing. This is it's a really important question that you're asking, and it's something I want to try to illuminate more in my dissertation, but it's something that I haven't yet completely hashed out. But I have thought about it a good bit, so I'm happy to be talking about it. For example, I think if you've read or heard of Gerald Horne's book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776,
I'm not familiar with that actually. But
he makes the argument that a poorly understood cause of the American Revolution was Britain's gradual the gradual abolition of slavery in Britain and in British territories. And that in different ways, this affected the colonists who felt like the writing was on the wall about slavery, and that this was not only something that would be impactful in the South for obvious reasons because of all the plantations, but actually in the North too, that the enormous profit margins, sometimes as high as 1,700%, were a big part of the economy and a big part of America's economic takeoff. Since the U.S. became an independent country, and so what you'd really be talking about there are not these to the extent that this is true, and I think you make some good arguments. I can't. I'm not expert enough in that particular time period to evaluate it with much confidence, but I think a lot of the arguments that he makes make sense. And what's important here for this, and what's relevant to this discussion, is that you'd be talking about elements of economic elites and the power that they had, but it's power that isn't visible to the people in the society, or to even necessarily to the other elites. And so that sort of like power that's the hidden side of power is in a way makes the deep state kind of something that transcends the particular just this particular era that we live in. What I think gives form to this tripartite state is the actual creation of a formally organized state, in addition to the democratic state, that is given all sorts of discretionary powers or prerogative powers and operates under a veil of secrecy. And that's what gives rise to this tripartite state that we deal with now, where it's very difficult to determine responsibility for particular policies and actions, and it's very difficult to know when the state in some way or another might be responsible for some particular event. And that is what I think is kind of novel about our particular moment, is that you have these centers of power, in state-society relations that have probably always been there, or been there for much of the history of civilization. But now you have the formally organized but very secretive security state at the same time, and how it's developed over the last several decades.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree with you. I mean, it's something I haven't put an extraordinary amount of thought into, and I probably should put more. But I raised the question because I know there was a small there's a chapter I read in, I can't remember the name of the book, but it was essentially a compendium about the works of David Ray Griffin. And are you familiar with David Ray Griffin, any of his works, his books? He's most famous for sort of arguing that 9/11 was an inside job. So he's been labelled very much as like a head conspiracy theorist for the 9/11 truth movement, but he's also he was a fairly, before that he was most renowned for he's a philosopher and theologian.
Yeah, he's a theologian, right? At
yes, yeah, and he had a small
Claremont College, or
yeah. Do you know what? I'm halfway through one of his books, but I read another one of his theology books. They're actually quite interesting and quite nuanced and sophisticated. He's clearly a very clever gentleman. But I just raised up because he in one of there was a book about his life and works, because he's retired now, and he invited Peter Dale Scott to write a chapter about his work on 9/11, and Peter, and then in the back on the second half of the book was David replying to all of the articles about his work, basically either defending them or defending his work, etc. I'm not sure what you'd call one of those types of books, but there probably is a name for it. Anyway, Peter is basically saying that there's a lack of sophistication within David's analysis of what occurred on 9/11, because we're actually talking about deep politics with these very subtle milieu and his idea of the deep state and what that means. And David's reply at the back of the book was saying that, my analysis is, that the neoconservatives such as Cheney and Rumsfeld, whether you believe or not 9/11 was whether you think it was an inside job or not, or whether you agree with all of David's arguments, he was basically saying that, the neoconservatives that were in charge, they were very much part of the public state. I mean, they were in the White House, in the executive. They were there in all the key modes of power. So he was basically saying, how can you call that the deep state? Because they were the public state. And you talked about their overlapping at certain time periods. So that's why I was just wanting to talk to you about that, about sort of, I guess, how useful the concept is when you have a case where you have neoconservatives, like a neoconservative with that mindset, which reflects very similar mindsets of that part of the deep state. During the Cold War, for example, and obviously, I know individuals such as Cheney and Rumsfeld. They were in certain key positions of power, weren't they? Even before, I know they became famous under George Bush Jr.'s presidency, but I know there are multiple governments before that. I'm sure you know a lot more about that than I do. But I mean, so you would say there's just during certain historical periods, there can be an overlapping here.
I think that there's always some kind of overlap between the between the overworld of private wealth and the democratic state. That seems to be pretty clear. Even amid when America was in the 20th century, when America was moving in the most socially democratic direction with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the White House, he still leaves the banking system largely unchanged. He doesn't create a public, a strong public option for banking that could supersede the power of the Federal Reserve and the private banks that basically run the Federal Reserve. And also during Roosevelt's presidency, you had the Council on Foreign Relations working with the State Department and funded by the Rockefeller Foundation to carry out the War and Peace Studies Project. Shoup and Mentor are two guys, one historian named Shoup and another named Mentor. They wrote Imperial Brain Trust on the Council on Foreign Relations, and they write about this project undertaken during the Roosevelt administration before the U.S. has even entered the war, and they're planning out basically the institutional architecture that'll be needed to run the world after America wins World War II and emerges in a position of unprecedented global power. And it's a way to run the world and manage the world on behalf of, really to the benefit of American economic interests, like especially people of the Rockefeller, that level of power. And so, this is under the America's most progressive presidents, most socially democratic administration, and even then they are really intertwined intimately with the pinnacle of capitalism. And so this is this is where I think that it's hard to say, even saying that, someone is in the public state and carrying out these policies and planning for different contingencies and so on. Well, who are these? Who are the people who decide who will be appointed to certain posts and so on? So you can't really disentangle the members of the public state from the private interests that support them and animate them anyway. Why do we end up with people like Rumsfeld and Cheney, and what interests do they represent? that would give us leaders of this particular bent again and again. Why does Obama have Victoria Nuland in such an important position where she is able to execute all of these neocon adventures in Ukraine and elsewhere, when really no part of Obama's electoral constituency would have favored that. So, what a deep state and a deep politics frame of reference is better at explaining some of these things.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean that definitely makes sense. I'd like to ask. Well, you said a couple of times in the first part of this podcast that the elites don't stick to the rules of the game, and I just wanted to ask you about that quote. Well, many critical law scholars and other critical theorists, they would argue that the rules of the game they're very much created from the ground up, or the bottom down rather, by the elite. And a Marxian analyst will say essentially that this is the ruling class, or the capitalist class has all the levers of power, and because of the hierarchical social relations and their control of the state apparatus, that the laws that are in and the rules that govern society are very much a product of the upper classes in that sense. So I guess the question is, why is it that there be elites breaking the rules that essentially that social strata or milieu had created themselves? So from a more conventional analysis, there might be arguments that, for example, I've read some, I can't quote it on the top of my head, but I've read some anarchist literature which basically said, well, conspiracies, they're just a consequence of this system, and there's no real importance focusing on them, because the structures and the underlying structures in the system in place, which is created by the elites from a very top down and sometimes bottom up way. This is what we should be focusing on, A, and B, that they don't really have, they sort of stick to the rules most of the time anyway, because they're the ones creating them. So why is it we should focus on say conspiracy or on the machinations of the elite?
Well, it's very true to say that they are responsible for creating the rules of the game. But in a liberal society, the rules of the game are created in part to win the consent of the public, as disorganized and nebulous and distractible as the public might be. So historically speaking, some of these institutions that get established are done to lend legitimacy to the ruling, or to the status quo, and in so doing, they create institutions that they can't totally ignore, but they do ignore, and they do violate. For example, the Constitution of the United States, the creation of the federal government, gets ratified in part because the Bill of Rights is added, and this is supposed to guarantee democratic rights to people so that they will not be abused under a tyrannical regime like they felt they were under British rule. And so they're given rights to free speech, freedom of assembly, rights trial by jury, no unwarranted search and seizure, and so on. But you can. So those are the rules that are set up, and the Constitution was crafted by elites, but the public, fights for and wins, or is given as a consolation prize certain concessions, like these democratic rights. But they get suspended early and often in the history of in American history. The Alien and Sedition Acts were used to silence political speech. Espionage acts, COINTELPRO, all the surveillance of the 60s and of political dissidents, the Red Scares, McCarthyism, many things that on their face violate the Constitution. So they do, the rules of the game were violated. I mean, they do lay out these constitutional rights that people are supposed to have. And then the state, being ever vigilant to threats to the status quo, ignores those rights and violates those rules, even though those rules were largely created by elites themselves. I mean, the Bill of Rights was written by James Madison, who was, the most, perhaps the most elitist of the founding fathers. And the other example, the Constitution also says that any treaty that we ratify is the highest law in the land. And yet the U.S. violates the UN Charter, which it did ratify, so routinely that it's, I couldn't even try to venture a guess as to how many times the U.S. has violated the UN Charter, and thus the leaders who were responsible for those particular policies would have been acting in an unconstitutional, illegal way. The UN Charter says you're not allowed to perpetrate aggression onto another nation, on another sovereign state, and you're not even allowed to threaten aggression. But the U.S., threatens people, overthrows governments, does these things routinely. I mean, they have bureaucratic procedures that they go through, probably involving a lot of boring routines at this point to accomplish these things. And so they are violating the rules that they have laid out for themselves. The surveillance and the collection of all this data, there's just innumerable things that would violate the Bill of Rights, even though the Bill of Rights and these constitutional rights were written largely by elites. And so, this lawlessness it's not particularly difficult to argue that this lawlessness exists. And so, what it is, it's troubling in that the implications of this lawlessness are not really hashed out very often. They're more, the younger generation seems to think like, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, so I don't care if they're surveilling me or collecting all my data or whatever. There's sort of a resignation about these things.
Yeah, no, that's it's completely true. I mean, I would generally agree with you as well. I mean, I was sort of playing devil's advocate there a little bit just to see what your answer was, but no, I'd agree. That's and also I'd bring in Nafeez Ahmed, some of his work. I believe it's in the Dual State, that book. Have you read that? The Dual State, Carl Schmitt and the National Security Complex.
Yeah, the second of Eric Wilson's.
Yes,
volumes.
Yeah, edited volumes. Yeah, they're really interesting ones. Yeah, and he has a chapter in it where he talks about he tries to bring in a Marxian analysis to the concept of the dual state and Carl Schmitt's sort of theorization of that. And yeah, he was essentially talking about as well how as it gets more and more difficult in late capitalist eras for elites and the capitalist class to accumulate wealth, they have to rely on more corrupt means and illegal activities to actually have that continued growth, that continued increase in capital, which I think is a really interesting idea, to the point that it'll become part of the system, and the corruption and the illegality becomes the norm, which is really...
There's a story that Michael Hudson says, and this is just one sort of anecdote that he provides, but he says that when he was working for Chase Manhattan, I recall this from an interview, so if my recollection is a little bit off, then so be it. But he says that he was working for Chase Manhattan, and that Robert McNamara comes in and says something to the effect that, well, we're having these balance of payments issues because of Vietnam War spending. You need to move more branches to certain parts of Latin America where a lot of the drug traffic, resides. And so, and McNamara was known as the kind of straight arrow. So, these practices, these parapolitical practices are, how much of the vital, the how much of the essence of the political economy now is shaped by this illegitimate economy that's intertwined with quote unquote legitimate high finance, if that's not a contradiction in terms or something, then it's complex. It's kind of unknowable in a way if you're not expert on financial flows, and you can't really. Starting to look at these bigger issues, you're kind of you're always hindered by our ability to have extensive knowledge of more than of multiple systems and so on. I think Peter Dale Scott is probably the guy who's written the best about all of these systems, and somehow they seem to be comprehensible to him. There's a few other people maybe in that vein, but how much of this illegitimate economy and these illegitimate political economies are essential to our way of life and our system and are necessary for upholding it. It's important and frightening.
Yeah, it is. It's a scary question to ask. It does need to be asked, though. I know in other countries, so there's some. I don't know how they do their actual analysis, but some have argued that almost a third of Italy's GDP, for example, comes out of the black market, which is dominated by various mafia organizations in southern Italy, and that they rely so much on the drug trade, which comes out of many parts of the world, going through these organized criminal gangs in Italy, and some of the payments that get made and some of the investment that gets made by their criminal gangs siphoning off this money into southern parts of Italy. It makes up a good portion of their GDP. Like, some have argued a third, others argue slightly less, like a fifth. But I mean, it's extraordinary that happens, and some of it's really so open that it's laughable, because I remember reading a story about a month ago. I can't quite remember where it's from now, but they were naming the very port that this organization, the mafia organization, controls. I think it's like the 'Ndrangheta, I think they're called in Italy, where the vast majority of the drugs that this gang go on to sell into other parts of Europe and around the world go through. That this port is, and that the authorities know this, right? If journalists know this, and the local police know it, right, and the central government of Italy know it, the question is, why haven't they done their usual thing of going in there, shutting it down, investigations, right? But it's been going on for decades, and I'm sure there's a lot of payments going to a lot of high up people in Italy's system, and it's quite renowned for being corrupt because of that sort of mafia stereotype. But I think more and more you can apply that to many, if not most, Western countries. I mean, in Britain, for example, there's a really interesting article in The Independent, which came out, I think, a couple of years ago now, where it was actually a police investigation into the fact that the organised criminal gangs were being let off the hook for all sorts of crimes because they infiltrated into certain Freemason lodges, and these Freemasonry lodges, they knew that high up judges were also members there, and they would befriend the judges and then bribe them, and so they'd be able to get away with their enterprises, because when it came through the court system, it would just be basically, well, whatever the judge would do to help them get away with it, for example. And I think that's interesting, because it shows that the corrupting force isn't just top down, and the controlling force sometimes isn't just top down from states, manipulating and controlling organised crime for their own good, but it can go the other way too, right? If you allow those nefarious elements to grow and expand, then you've got sort of almost double agents. You think they're working for you, even though you're part of this organised, this internal state sort of milieu, and you think you're controlling this organised criminal gang for your own benefit, but then they end up actually getting the control over certain state arms as well. So, which is, I don't know whether you had any thoughts about that. I mean, sort of, do you think the hierarchy is very rigid, or it's more fluid, and you can have the organized crime and even terrorist organizations that exerting their own forms of control and corruption into the states that are trying to manipulate them?
It's an important question. I don't really have a working theory on how these things are managed, or if they are managed, or if there's a sort of a kind of a managing of the chaos in a particular way, that as long as certain realms function as they are supposed to, quote unquote, then they have a bit of autonomy within these realms, and to operate free of prosecution or with certain token prosecutions at certain times. I don't know. The Italian case is fascinating. If you have that book, Government of the Shadows.
Yes, yeah.
And the piece in there from Daniel Ganser on Italy and Gladio, where he writes about that. Yeah. And it's one of those, like, when you start talking about Masonic lodges, I feel a little wary, because I know the associations with that. But what he writes about with the Propaganda Due Lodge, and how they were sort of that they had links with elite politicians, the head of the security service, and organized crime, and the CIA as well, and that they were involved in carrying out acts of false flag terror, like the Piazza Fontina bombing, and I think a Bologna railway station bombing. And some of this actually came out in the 90s after the Cold War, and is fairly well documented. There's a good BBC documentary on Gladio, and it shows how that you almost couldn't. It's like Stieg Larsson, really. It's like a Stieg Larsson novel, only on a much bigger scale. It affected Italian politics tremendously. Probably is in some way related to the death of Aldo Moro. They never really got to the bottom of it. It was, and there was apparently a CIA hand involved in some way or another in terms of managing this or controlling was some sort of relation between the security service and NATO and the CIA, between the Italian security service and these shadowy organizations of right wing terror and organized crime, and they were managed for political purposes at times. And think about what just happened in Turkey with the terror attacks that preceded the recent election, and a couple of very prominent political scientists. A guy I always mispronounce. I think I mispronounce his name, but Asamoglu and Robinson. They've written some important seminal works in political science, and they had an article recently about Turkey, and they referenced the work of Daniel Ganser, and they're talking about the deep state. And I was very interested to see this, because these are guys that are more respectable political scientists. They're not these radicals out there like me. They're more established, and so I was encouraged that they would approvingly cite Ganser's work, because Ganser's done really amazing research into Gladio and into Italy. And so maybe this is a time where, as we search for answers as to what happened to get us to this profoundly undemocratic moment, that the academy might start to relax these barriers that have been imposed on us for so long.
Yes, hopefully. With regards to Turkey, obviously very suspicious, and the fact there's no formal investigation, and so we don't know who did it. And then who did it? And it was probably ISIS. And then it was definitely ISIS. And then thank God the Kurdish forces and individuals in Turkey were, obviously they're not as they weren't duped, and they were happy to say that this is an act of state terrorism in their opinion, and they're clearly doing it to manipulate the election. And some of that gets into the English media, what the parties are saying, but institutions such as the BBC, mainstream ones, I mean, they don't do talk about or offer any analysis with regards to Turkey's deep and very corrupted state and the history of it. They'll just reference, well, the opposition party claims this is state violence, however the state denies this. That's it. They'll have one line saying that the opposition said state violence, but the state denies this. Well, of course, okay, great. Thank you for talking so in depthly about that, BBC News, but it's unfortunate that those sort of things occur. I had one sort of final question for you. So I think it's quite clear to anyone who looks into the phenomena surrounding deep state and deep politics in general that it's not. This isn't just deviant individuals who happen to be acting corrupt at this particular point in time with a certain mindset, right? These aren't just ad hoc crimes which occur, which you can get rid of by arresting a handful of people who you think are sort of the corrupt leaders. And personally, I don't think that's a very valid viewpoint. Maybe some mainstream criminologists or law scholars might think that this is, well, if there's corruption, you have to find who's corrupt and get rid of them. It's not the system. But I mean, so do you have any thoughts about how do we stop or how do we get rid of this phenomenon, the tripartite state phenomenon, and the larger, broader phenomenon of deep politics and all its corrupting influence on society?
Well, I think that perhaps a more promising development is if it doesn't somehow bring about the destruction of humanity. As the decline of U.S. unipolarity, I think perhaps offers some opportunities for introspection, and the elites may think, what sort of how do we want to exist in this multipolar world? The domination, perpetual domination, and a new American century. That these are no longer really tenable, and perhaps we could, open the spectrum of allowable critique, and then try to think about how we might make a better world. That may be a very optimistic point of view, but I think that something with the decline in American hegemony and a broadening of allowable critique could together create the space needed for people to be able to manage the big problems that we face and that we are totally paralyzed to deal with now. Social justice issues, basic issues of equity, ecological issues, potentially catastrophic ecological issues. We're under this current system. We're completely unable to address any of these things. And the considerable genius of humanity is not able to be brought to bear under these circumstances. And it's a largely a political problem, but it's potentially catastrophic if we don't deal with it. And so I'm hoping that perhaps a decline in this project to dominate the world forever, this sort of American/Anglo-American project, that if it ends, then and it starts to decline, then maybe ideas that were unacceptable before, people will start to look at them again, and people will want a good sort of post-mortem about what's happened to us and how we got to the point that we're at now.
Okay, I mean, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the pessimist of me, or the cynic, would say that, well, as the US is declining, we obviously see a country such as China rising and potentially filling its place, where You know, I mean, historically, China's, you know, through human history, China's been one of the economic centres of the world, or the economic centre of the world, and it's almost like it's going back to its traditional place as the sort of the central hub of activity. And I worry that obviously China has its own very corrupt forces within it as well, and that even though they're very different from the West culturally, with and you know some of their just their social habits and mindset, the fact that capitalism or this really this corporatism, or whatever you'd want to call it, this really corrupted and controlled version of capitalism in China, you know, potentially as that seeps over into the rest of the world and overtakes Western sort of this Western capitalism, that it's going to have its own problems, right? And I mean, I guess the cynic in me would be that even if as the US and the West, as they decline, the forces which rise in their place could be just as bad and will have their own problems, you know. And part of me, the radical part of me, thinks we really have to, I don't know how it can be done, but we really have to think about changing the system and the structures as they are from the ground up, you know, just social relations. So whether that means capitalism or statism or nationalism, all these forces which dominate the world, you know, I think they're all problematic, and I think social critics have really rigorously pointed out and shown how problematic they are for hundreds of years now. But you know, it hasn't changed much, which is that's the cynical part of me, a bit more worried about the future. I'm really hoping something gets done. You know, I mean, climate change, nuclear war, they're still, you know, huge threats. Maybe these still the biggest threats to humanity. I'm not sure. But maybe we should end it on that rather pessimistic note. Is that okay? Do you mind?
Yeah, I hope that the worst scenarios do not come to pass, but you know, what as ever, what can we do?
No, exactly. We'll try our very best from the bottom up, and maybe through education and some emancipatory thought that more rational and or just more intelligent and benevolent forces and individuals prevail in this sort of really desperate climate that we're in, or that humanity has been in for at least the last half a century or so. And we'll end it there for Cave Escape. So thank you for everyone for listening, and I'll be back in the next week talking to Paul once again, and hopefully in the future we'll get a few more interviews with some interesting individuals such as the likes of Aaron Good. So thank you, Aaron, for joining us, and thank you for spending your time. I'll let you get back to doing your PhD research.
All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome.